Good morning and welcome to the 15th Behavior, Energy, and Climate Change Conference. Good morning, good morning. This year's theme is Reimagining the Future. Reimagining the future. So as people join, I invite you to imagine that you are at Beck 2030, 9 years from now. And write in the chat, what is your vision of this low carbon future? What is your vision for this low carbon future? Are the Kardashians now living in tiny homes and using ThreadUp? You know, what is your vision? Please share via the chat your vision for this low carbon future. Again, welcome to Beck. Welcome to the 15th Behavior, Energy, and Climate Change Conference. We're happy to have you. And I invite people to add to the chat their vision of a low carbon future. So don't be shy. Waiting for people. Equity. Oh, I see some coming in. Cities and communities that are functionally indistinguishable from nature. Nice. Solar, renewables prevail. Green energy that is affordable for everyone. Solar punk. Yes, I'm hoping that my town, I can convince everyone or at least half of people to decarbonize both buildings and transportation. Again, welcome to Beck. I see people still joining. Please add your vision of a low carbon future. Let's start, kick off our conference with really reimagining the future and get us kicked off here. All right, great. Healthier, wealthier, wiser. Heavy consumerism is no longer the standard practice. Nice. Yeah, great quotes here. Great ideas. All right. Place-based, resilient communities. Nice. Circular economy. Okay. Fossil-free. Yes. Okay, these are great ideas. Thank you for sharing them. All right, well, again, good morning and welcome to Beck. My name is Therese Peffer, and I'm one of many people that help organize Beck. Beck is co-convened by 3 organizations: the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy, or ACEEE, nonprofit research and advocacy organization focused on energy efficiency; the Stanford Environmental and Energy Policy Analysis Center, CPAC, undertakes and disseminates research that can help decision makers shape environmental and energy policy; and the California Institute for Energy and Environment at Citrus at UC Berkeley manages and conducts energy research in the public interest. So here you see Naomi, Reuben, Steve from ACEEE. Joanna joined us this year as our conference coordinator. Jim Sweeney from Stanford, and Carol Lee, myself, Chris, and Carl Blumstein from CIEE. And we get a lot of help from Beth Carlin from the Sea Change Institute. She provides invaluable input to the conference. So through the participation of hundreds of people, we have put together an exciting conference for our plenaries. This morning, in just a few minutes, well, I think afternoon for many of you, we have Michael Pollan and Andy Revkin. Tomorrow, we'll have a conversation with DOE's Kathleen Hogan. On Wednesday, we will hear from behavioral insights teams in governments around the world, and we will close with a fantastic panel to discuss how to identify greenhouse gas emission reduction priorities. We like to keep it real at Beck, and tomorrow we'll have a couple of solution skills sessions to put your great minds at work to brainstorm solutions to some real problems. This afternoon, we have 3 workshops. No need to register, please come. And each day there is a poster session. So don't miss those. Come and talk to the people presenting posters, and you'll be able to interact with them there. We like to keep Beck very social, especially during these times where we are virtual. So we like to, I know people come to Beck to meet others, to network, to make friends. So we're trying to keep up that great spirit as we move forward. So here's some ways that you can participate. We have yoga, over the next 2 mornings. We have a do not miss climate action role-playing game on Wednesday afternoon. For some of you, there is Beck Together. And these are informal gatherings in cities with high attendance numbers. So go ahead and if you are in any of these cities, please contact these folks, you know, whether it's Boulder or Washington, D.C. and so forth today, this evening, or on Wednesday, Berkeley, Orange County, or Madison, Wisconsin. Please contact these folks and go ahead and join. It'd be fantastic. The best way to access everything over the next few days here is through Socio. So I'm hoping that everyone has gone on. You can, there's a link to get on through the conference website itself. And then once you're in, you can choose, you can go to the agenda and you can choose which events that you want to go to. And you can use the connections to contact people and interact with people as you meet them. You can use the social wall to make announcements. This was like our bulletin board of the past. And so anyway, so please use Socio to move forward and connect with each other through the conference. We can't put this conference together without our sponsors. So a big thank you to all of our sponsors. We have National Grid, Oracle. We have a sponsor for each day of the conference. So the Energy Coalition, Uplight, ICF. At the supporter level, we have Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, the U.S. Department of Energy, SoCal Gas, AEG, DNV. We have Guidehouse, ADM, Apprise, Illume, Cadmus, Energy Trust of Oregon, Resource Innovations. We have branded workshops throughout the year. Guidehouse and Energy Code ACE have taken advantage of this. Session sponsors, the Energy Coalition, Uplight, ICF, and we have workshops. So workshop sponsor is the Energy Coalition. Our sponsor today is the Energy Coalition. So big thanks to them. The Energy Coalition is proud to sponsor the first day of the 2021 Behavior, Energy, and Climate Change Conference. The Energy Coalition is a California-based nonprofit organization that empowers communities to leap into the future of clean energy. The Energy Coalition envisions a future in which communities are energy-producing networks and clean energy is affordable and accessible for everyone. You can learn more at energycoalition.org. And now I'll hand it over to Jim Sweeney to talk about the Beck Fellows Program. Jim?
Thank you, Therese. I'd like to welcome the 28 Beck Fellows that we have here at the conference. Beck Fellows are students, they're undergraduates, graduates, postdocs. They're selected after review of applications competitively, come from many different countries. The Beck Fellows program started with the first Beck conference. Then we called them Precourt Fellows, at the time funded by the Precourt Energy Efficiency Center at Stanford. Beck Fellows in the more recent years, same concept. The purpose of the Beck Fellows program is to allow the students, who we consider the next generation of leaders, to connect with one another and to initiate a network that may persist, if it works well, for their lifetimes. We hope that Beck will encourage, we also hope that Beck will encourage these fellows to make career choices consistent with the Beck themes. I look forward to all the Beck Fellows participating in the reception at 6 p.m. Eastern Time, and to start that networking process by introducing themselves to each other. And then for you more established members of Beck, please, I ask you to greet any Beck Fellows you meet during the conference and welcome them into the Beck community. Thank you. And I turn this back to Therese.
Thanks, Jim. Now a few more thank yous and then we'll move forward. So big thanks to the social committee for keeping Beck fun, social, and improving our networks. Thank you to the program committee. These are the folks who take the time to review the many abstracts we receive and really shape the program. And thank you to the tech operators for helping Beck run so smoothly. Please be sure to interact with Beck through all of our social media, Twitter, LinkedIn, throughout the year, and Facebook, and of course, Socio. And please save the date for next year. Well, we'll be back in person, very excited about that, and in Washington, DC. Okay, now to kick off our opening plenary, please use the Q&A box for questions, and you can upvote the questions with the like button. The moderator, Andy Revkin, will ask questions throughout the session. Use the chat box for a lively discussion during the session, and this and all sessions are being recorded. I will now hand it over to Chris to introduce our speakers.
Thank you, Therese. Well, as you can all imagine, we are just thrilled to have Michael Pollan and Andy Revkin kick off this year's conference. Andy Revkin is one of America's most honored and experienced environmental journalists. Many of you know him from the New York Times as reporting. He's also founding director of the new initiative on communication and sustainability at Columbia University's Earth Institute. I really recommend subscribing to his webcast and his blog called Sustain What. So just Google Sustain What Andy Revkin, and you'll find his solutions-focused stories on climate change. So today, Andy will be interviewing Michael Pollan with the theme, Reimagining the Future of Food. So as many of you know, Michael Pollan is #1 best-selling author of many books exploring the socio-cultural and environmental impacts of food and other substances. His books include How to Change Your Mind, This Is Your Mind on Plants, Cooked, Food Rules, In Defense of Food, The Omnivore's Dilemma, and The Botany of Desire. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with these books. He's also a journalist, an activist, and the Knight Professor of Science and Environmental Journalism at UC Berkeley's School of Journalism. So wonderful, we were able to kick this off a few minutes early. And with that, I'm gonna pass it over to Andy Revkin. Thank you both so much for joining us.
It's just great to be here and see my friend Michael on the other coast. Although you were in Massachusetts for a while too.
I'm in this coast. Yeah, I'm on the East Coast.
Oh, you are? Yeah, right. Are you still
I'm in
at
Cambridge.
Harvard?
Yeah, I'm teaching at Harvard. In fact, this afternoon.
Well, it's great to have you squeeze in here. It's great to be part of this. I thought, a way to start would be to circle back to 2006 and this really provocative, pioneering book, Omnivore's Dilemma, in which you explored those questions that all of us who eat more than one kind of food from animals as well as from plants face. And, just so going your little time travel trip back to then and thinking now with what's happened with the food conversation, what wasn't in the book then? What wasn't in the conversation then that you, like if you did a from scratch book pitch, what would that be right now?
Well, I think looking back, what's surprising is how little attention really we were paying to the links between food and climate change as a culture. I touched on it in Omnivore's Dilemma. I was acutely aware of the fact that the way we were and are growing food is based heavily on fossil fuels, and that we should see the food system as another fossil fuel technology, at least as it was organized. And what I had in mind was the huge amount of fossil fuels that it takes to make fertilizer, nitrogen fertilizer, which makes the whole system work. It's how you can grow all that corn. And there was some hints at the power of rotational grazing, say, to sequester carbon in soils. But the conversation was not happening. I remember when Inconvenient Truth came out, and I was kind of shocked that there was not a single mention of food or agriculture. And I remember haranguing Al Gore at a conference a couple of years later. Why not? Why not? The big change since then, I think, is most of us recognize that, for example, our meat eating is one of the most significant parts of our climate footprint. And that was not generally recognized. And also the potential of agriculture, unique among industries, to mitigate some of its own carbon emissions. And I think that's very distinctive fact about agriculture. So the culture has come a long way. Policy? No, not yet. We hear promises from the Biden administration and from Tom Vilsack, his Secretary of Agriculture, that there are cool plans in the offing to encourage farmers to grow crops in ways that will sequester more carbon than they admit. But that hasn't happened yet.
And on the plate, what's the difference now? I'd like to talk about a couple of themes going forward, especially because there's a behavior change focus to this conference. And a lot of what we think about in thinking about energy and behavior change was predated by public health and behavior change and food and behavior change. Reach for the cookie or the apple.
Right.
In energy, we're definitely still going for the cookie.
Yeah, there is some shift going on. I think one of the more exciting things is to see this renaissance of food science to create new plant-based foods. Many of them simulating animal-based protein, whether you're talking about Beyond Burgers or Impossible Burgers, or all the new kinds of cheeses and sausages and spreads. I mean, as someone who no longer eats meat, I'm kind of stunned now that even in the most conventional grocery store, there is this area where you can get plant-based versions of meat. Now, there are questions how healthy those items are, but they do have a lower carbon footprint. I do think that there is at least, at the level of what's fashionable, a lot more interest in plant-based diets, more people becoming vegetarians and vegans for environmental reasons. And I'm encouraged by that. And I think that is going to, now that you have so much capital moving into this area of food processing and food science, I mean, huge amounts of capital, because this is a growing market. There will be more appealing alternatives to people, and it will make it easier for people to get off of meat and beef in particular, and not a moment too soon.
Yeah, and the scale issue on things like beef is still extraordinary. One question, of course, there too at the global scale is China, and its food choices and decisions are so enormous. And at the same time, Singapore has started to have at least one restaurant. So there's one restaurant in that part of Asia now that has manufactured meat. It's a chicken substitute. You probably have kept track of this.
Is this the lab grown or
the lab grown, right?
Yeah, and that's coming. I have yet to try it. I'm not chomping at the bit.
So to speak.
But it's coming, and apparently, animal rights absolutists think it's a good idea, and we'll see how it goes. We'll see if they can produce it at the right price. One of the things that's really striking about the simpler versions of meat substitutes, such as Impossible and Beyond, is that they cost more than beef. And if you buy that beef is, that cows are a very inefficient way to produce a food, given that we waste, 90% of them, and that they consume 10 units of feed for every unit of edible food, you would think that creating burgers out of soy or other common agricultural commodities, pea protein, would be really cheap. The fact that it isn't is a tell, I think, that we are still subsidizing the beef economy to an enormous extent. And that has to stop. I mean, if we want to drive this change in consumer behavior, it's just inexcusable that we're subsidizing cattle in a great many ways.
I wanted to show something here. A long time ago in the Hudson Valley where I live, Lenape territory here, named for Henry Hudson, who just got here in 1609. I started writing about sort of a new definition of the locavore. You know, the traditional locavore, the Alice Waters locavore, my friend from your corner of the world, is something has to grow nearby or you won't use it. But then here in the Hudson Valley now, we have a company raising steelhead salmon in Hudson, the town of Hudson, which is supplying increasingly New York. In Maine, where I'm spending more time, where my wife's family is from, at a different scale, there's a Norwegian seafood salmon provider is trying to move into growing salmon here in farms in a closed system. There's lots of controversy about aspects of this because the market is here. In other words, bring the salmon, bring the protein, bring the thing to where the market is one of these. It's not really a technology solution so much as it is a geographic solution. I don't know if that is something you think about. Do we have to get more of a comfort level with locavore having different meanings?
Yeah, I mean, I think that locavores, I mean, if our concern is climate, again, the idea of locavore, the idea of organic, these aspirations were developed before we really were grappling with climate change. Take organic for an example. This was a powerful set of rules for how to grow food based on what, when it started, was the most serious environmental crisis we faced, which was pesticides. This grows out of the 60s and 70s, and the rules were designed to minimize pesticide use or synthetic pesticide use. If you were drawing up organic rules now, I think they would look very different. They would have much more emphasis on perennial agriculture, growing in ways that sequester carbon. Because actually right now, organic rules in some ways cut against mitigating carbon. They use frequent tillage, for example, to deal with weeds. And every time you till, you're emitting a gust of carbon. So we have to update our concepts. And when it comes to locavore, there have been a lot of interesting studies that's, some say that importing lamb from New Zealand, for example, to England has a lower carbon footprint than growing lamb in England, where it's fed grain, whereas there's plenty of grass in New Zealand. So that's why we have to move toward a system with a really reliable measure of carbon impact or carbon footprint for food, because it's going to be more complicated than just local or just organic.
How have you dealt with the, I guess you call it label overload or mission overload? Fair trade coffee, organic coffee, low carbon coffee. When we think about what you're talking about, measurement and communication of the measurement, how do we avoid just sort of like people getting totally fuzzed out or not trusting things?
Well, I think trust is a huge issue. I mean, there's a lot of people who distrust organic labels at this point because the standards have been diluted in various ways, and there's a certain amount of cheating that goes on. And that makes me, yet I still think the organic label is the most trustworthy in that it's actually audited and by licensed, auditors, whereas you've got a lot of labels that are bullshit, frankly. The Whole Grain Council, I mean, look closely. It's like 51% whole grain, and you can call your product whole grain. I mean, how does that compute? So I think it's definitely an issue. And I think that when we do develop that carbon, standard, we're going to have to put some muscle behind it, governmental or some nonprofit that will have to establish trust. Because you do risk people throwing up their hands in various ways. But on the other hand, the big questions are simple, and we can all figure them out. Beef, as you mentioned, right. Beef is someday we will look at eating beef as we will look at burning coal. Just a really bad idea, and a low-hanging fruit when it comes to changing, our behavior. There are alternatives. If you're not ready to go all the way to a plant-based diet, moving to chicken makes a significant difference. Right. Instead of 10 to 1, I think it's 2 or 3 to 1 in terms of feed per unit of food produced. So, we love to complicate things as a species, and but here's some of the most important issues are really straightforward. And, by the way, we've known this about beef from Frances Moore Lepay, whose Diet for a Small Planet just turned 50 this year.
Amazing.
And she was making the point that there's, you know, if we're concerned about feeding the world as we should be, well, then the answer is to cut down on beef and use all the grain we're growing to feed cattle to feed people, which solves the feed the world problem pretty quickly, if indeed you can get the first world to give up on meat. But you alluded to China, and the fact is that eating meat is such a status symbol in the developing world. It's a sign you've made it into the middle class, that appetites for meat may be declining here, but they're rising elsewhere in the world, specifically in China. And I think that's really concerning. I remember World Watch, I think, did a analysis many years ago, and they said that if the Chinese began eating meat at the rates Americans do, we would need 2.3 more worlds to grow all the grain to feed them. Obviously, this is not going to happen. But that pressure is going to be intense, and the way the Chinese are feeding their population pork now, you know, is to grow it in North Carolina and Iowa, leave all the and have us grow all the feed for that pork and deal with all the waste. They've totally externalized the cost of growing meat, and now we're paying them in this country. And that's an unsustainable situation for sure.
It's so interesting. Let's go to the supermarket. Let's go to like a Walmart. One of the things that I still grapple with, and this is for energy as much as food, is the scale monster. I start thinking of words as monsters. There's an uncertainty monster. There's the scale monster. Scale monster, to me, is when you think about our food and energy norms. It's New York City has 1 million buildings, and 85% of them will still be standing in 2050. This idea we have of a clean new future is really a lot of it's about renovation or dealing with that scope of making those buildings more efficient. And in our mass market for food is not like probably the market you and I choose our food from. Is that wake you up, keep you up at night? Like to take these norms to the Walmart scale, and I've written in the past about Walmart's light bulb stuff, but
Yes,
their light bulb choices are still pushed out amid this consumption message that's so much bigger. Is that a nightmare or an opportunity?
Well, I think it's both. I mean, the irony is that this highly centralized system, when one company like Walmart makes changes, they can change a lot. And I don't know where they stand right now. I haven't checked in on Walmart, but a few years ago, they were making a real push around sustainable food. And they were, they are the largest purveyor of organic food in the country. They sell a lot of organic food. It's mostly milk and a handful of other ingredients, but it still represents a lot of acreage being treated organically. But Walmart is interesting too, because a few years ago, when they were at the height of their concern about sustainability, they did a life cycle assessment of the whole company, and they wanted to see where they were using the most carbon, where was the biggest problem. And what they discovered shocked them as well as me. It was not heating and cooling all those big box stores. It was not that that international distribution network of trains and automobiles and trucks and everything. It was the nitrogen fertilizer going on the cornfields at the base of their food chain.
Amazing.
And a lot of that was turning into high fructose corn syrup that was, in the soda. But that was their biggest problem from a climate point of view. And they began to address it by various programs to insist. I mean, nitrogen is low-hanging fruit. It's generally understood that farmers use twice as much as the plants need.
Right.
Why? Because it's cheap and because it's crop insurance. Rather put on too much than too little. This is not too hard to address. And the problem is when you have a surplus of nitrogen fertilizer, whatever is not taken up by the plants, when it gets wet, turns into nitrous oxide. And this is, as bad as methane. It's a very, a very effective heat trapping gas. So any kind of efforts that could be driven by a company like Walmart to reduce nitrogen in the food system is going to achieve quite a bit. But we should also be taxing nitrogen. We should be penalizing farmers who use too much of it. It should be treated like the precious resource it is. And again, it's a case where, because of various subsidies and lack of regulation, this kind of waste can go on.
There's one area, and we'll be moving to some of the audience questions, which are fantastic in a couple of minutes. One area that interests me is, and I know you and I have interacted with this before, is the discomfort level with bigness. To me, a lot of the GMO aversions are more about bigness and corporate labels than they are about what they do for food. The same thing for land use. Intensification of agriculture, getting more production from the same chunk of land, can limit the deforestation. This has been shown through history, where there's this idea of peak farmland. And how much of the path toward a successful outcome for food and energy, that intermix and climate, comes from getting more comfortable with size? Or, corporate players.
What context you're talking about? In the American context, does intensifying production mean treating agriculture as a sacrifice zone ecologically? Or are you intensifying at the same time you're using more sustainable systems? Worldwide, intensified industrial agriculture doesn't feed a high percentage of the world's people. I think 2/3 or 75% of people are still fed by peasant agriculture. So it isn't clear that intensification and amassing land into major tracts is appropriate in that context. And there's good evidence it isn't. Peasant agriculture could be made efficient in certain ways, but if you do it by throwing people off the land and going to are you intensifying in terms of output per unit of land or per farmer? We've done very well intensifying both, but especially per farmer. Our farmers, industrial farmers, produce an unimaginably large, historically speaking, amount of food per unit, but we've depopulated the farm belt in doing so, because the kind of food you can produce that way is also not real food. It's corn and soy, which nobody eats directly. It's all, cattle feed and chicken feed. So I think making those generalizations, they really need to be broken down and looked at more carefully. It's not just producing food, it's what kind of food. Who are you feeding? And do you want to remove people from the land in the developing world, which means that they will move to the cities and be impoverished? And so I think the answers are different in different places. I think we have to be very contextual in our solutions. We already have this highly industrial system, and working with it to make it greener and more sustainable since we do have powerful federal leverage into what gets grown and how it gets grown, since most farmers get, I think on average 40% of farm income is federal money. That's a powerful leverage that no one dares use, but we're going to have to dare eventually. But the potential's there. I mean, I have more optimism about agriculture than a lot of other sectors, in that farmers are responding to the incentives that come down from agricultural policy in Congress. And those incentives now are grow as much corn and soy as you can. There's no reason we couldn't change it. We have around the edges with conservation programs. But what if, instead of rewarding farmers for, yield of whatever it is, they were rewarded for the amount of carbon that they sequestered, or that was a condition of getting your subsidy checks. I think that we need to look at those kind of questions, because it's not a free enterprise system in agriculture at all. It's a mixed system. The government plays a huge role. And it seems to me the public should be getting more for those dollars than cheap soda.
That sounds pretty good to me. I have one last question. This is more on the adaptation side of climate and agriculture. Bill Maher made a really funny point on his show a while back, maybe a month or two ago. I'll show that, where he noted correctly that the country is getting wetter in the east and drier in the west. That means a lot for wildfire. It also means a lot when you think about food. His solution that he pitched was to move water west through engineering. And that may sound, it was a good joke line, but it's actually, there are people who've been looking at this, like Henry Miller. My proposal when I saw that was move the agriculture east. In other words, the salad bowl of your part of the world, just east of you, is a historic relic of subsidized water that people in the Southeast are saying, you stole our agriculture and now we want it back. So is there a way to envision a new America when it comes to food and energy, which again, water is energy in so many places?
Well, the biggest absurdity is that only in the last 10 years, dairy has moved out of New England and Wisconsin to the deserts of California and New Mexico. This is just insane. These animals can eat grass, which we cannot eat, and turn it into valuable protein. And yet we take them and we put them on the desert and we feed them grain grown in the Midwest. Why does this make sense? Well, because nobody wants to graze cattle anymore. They want to keep them confined for efficiency. And when they live in the desert, they spend less of their metabolism keeping warm, as they must do when they're, in Wisconsin, which, by the way, they don't mind at all, but their productivity goes down. So yeah, we need to move the agriculture where it makes the most sense. In terms of the water, actually, my wife has been saying, what about all these pipelines we're fighting over? Could they be repurposed to move water around the country?
That was Bill Maher's
Oh,
pitch.
really?
Yeah.
Well, maybe. We'll take some of that water if you thoroughly clean that pipeline first.
Yeah, there though too, there's still the cost and energy in moving the water can be really interesting. So let's see some. I'm going to go to the questions here in the queue. How many more minutes can you be with us?
10.
Awesome. Here's a question about budgets. Tens of millions of U.S. families, this is Bill LeBlanc, are budget constrained with their food. They often have to prioritize other costs like healthcare, energy, transport over food. How might we use what we know about food purchase patterns for this huge population group to solve the cost issue while helping the environment? Is there a cost component to moving toward better energy outcomes for food?
Generally, making food more sustainable makes it more expensive so far, and that's a huge inhibiting factor. No politician wants to do anything that makes food more expensive. I mean, going back to the French Revolution, this is like bad politics. The reason food is so cheap was partly because Richard Nixon had a scare around food price inflation and hired an agriculture secretary to figure out, who was an agricultural economist, do whatever you can to drive down food prices, and we're living with the results of that. So eventually, if you're going to do what you need to make the food system greener, you're also going to need to pay people more to deal with the real cost of food. I mean, none of us pay the real cost of food. It's heavily subsidized. Yet those subsidies are now built into our economy. The reason that people have been able to endure what are essentially falling wages since the 1970s is that food prices were falling too. So cheap food subsidized this collapse in wages. And we're going to have to remedy that. I mean, it is being remedied to some extent right now because of these, labor shortages. But it's definitely a problem that has to be confronted, is the cost problem. If we're going to pay the real cost of food, we have to give people enough money to afford it.
And what's your take on the waste issue? We have this is the energy efficient economy meeting, and the food efficient economy would have a lot less waste. I know this is an issue here.
Well, if food gets more expensive, people will be more careful and not waste it. I mean, I think to some extent, the waste issue is an epiphenomenon of low prices. To throw out half a cabbage or a head of lettuce just isn't very expensive. So that's part of it. There are many dimensions to the waste issue. The collapse of a really vibrant culture of cooking has made it a lot worse. People used to know what to do with those sad, limp celeries in their fridge. They would make a soup. We had all these recipes that were essentially geared toward dealing with food that was about to go bad. Or we could ferment things and preserve them that way. And so when people are cooking regularly, which is to say more nights than not during the week, they'll roll their food over. They will not waste. But if you're only cooking once or twice a week, you're going to waste a lot of food. So it's a cultural matter. It's an economic matter. But talk about low-hanging fruit. If we really are wasting 40% of the food, it's criminal. And of course, we know what happens to that food when it goes into the landfill. It rots and turns into methane. So it's definitely an important issue. I haven't written about it that much, but I think it is an important issue. But I do think it's tied to not having a culture of cooking. And I'll bet it went down during the pandemic, where people cooked more and were at home more,
right?
And noticed that that celery before it got really sad.
So maybe there's a Pollan family table successor cookbook in this, ugly vegetable cookbook.
Yeah, well, there have been chefs that have, Dan Barber,
Oh, I know, yeah,
has made some wonderful food out of garbage.
I've had his eggs that were poached in the compost. The temperature is high enough in a sealed container. Yeah. So, and there's a question about crickets. Basically, what's the novelty we're not thinking about? And maybe I'll throw in CRISPR technology. We had a back and forth on golden rice. What are some breakthroughs that might happen? Whether it's a new source of protein or
eating insects is an interesting one. There's a ton of protein that we're not eating that other cultures are eating. I think there's a big taboo in our culture against eating insects, and food taboos are hard to change. Sushi is the notable exception, that we all learned how to enjoy raw fish. But in my view, the more logical way to deal with insect protein is to feed it to the animals that we do want to eat.
right?
That chickens are very happy on crickets or mealworms or any number of other things. It's great. I mean, it's a great food source for them. Also, you were talking about, enclosed aquaculture. The challenge with aquaculture is that we usually feed other fish at the bottom of the ocean food chain, and that's had devastating effects. But Will Allen showed that you could grow soldier fly larvae in closed systems and have very happy, tasty, nutritious fish. So I would rather, feed the bugs to the chicken and the fish, and then feed the fish and the chicken to us. That seems to me a more realistic way to go.
And to a certain extent, it'll probably be an all of the above future, meaning
without question. Yeah.
I've written that line more than once.
The market will drive it, obviously, in lots of ways, but
and local conditions, local
yeah.
markets.
But I mean, I think getting aquaculture right is a really important project. There are sustainable ways to do aquaculture. I mean, we do know with shellfish, it's a more sustainable system usually. But figuring out these systems, closed systems, getting the feed right, I think the potential there is great. And of course, you can produce nitrogen, which you need for your farmland
For
from
sure.
fish waste.
Well, and this is something that literally grew out of the pandemic too. Karen Earhart Martinez asks about the role of home gardens in the solution, including the climate question.
I think home gardens are really important, and I was very excited to see shortages of seeds when I went to order my seeds. I couldn't find seed potato all last year. And yes, I think it's significant on many levels. You can produce surprising amounts of really good food anywhere in the country in a garden. You are also getting exercise. You are getting the freshest, most nutritious food you can possibly get. And you're kind of, learning things about, my whole education in the environment happened in the garden. That's really, I really learned about the relations between different species, ourselves included, how to deal with pests and what was wrong with the way we were dealing with pests, the fact that humans can actually improve nature, which we've forgotten because we're in such a state of despair, but that there is a relationship between us and the land that we garden that is a reminder of nature's abundance on one hand, and the fact that we can have a positive impact on the environment. So simply as a morale booster, I think the garden is a precious place.
Maybe a last question here before you're going to teach and stuff from me. I was with Alice Waters 2 or 3 years ago at a climate meal in San Francisco. It was when they had that summit, and one of the most interesting aspects of it was seeing her where she makes the menu into a tutorial. In other words, and thinking about schools and kids, you teach at Berkeley, I'm at Columbia. There are students I know are working at Columbia dealing with the food system there, and it's kind of a nightmare. Path dependency, big companies can't change to local
Foreign
sourcing
contracts, yeah.
all. It's but what's the role of education and student potential and kind of taking this forward? Having the menu, having the curriculum be edible.
Yeah. When I first got to Berkeley and met Alice and started learning about the edible schoolyard where kids grow food, this is in middle school, and then they learn how to cook it, it seemed like a really cute idea. The more time goes on, the more brilliant I think it is. We know how hard it is to change any habits in adults. We need to reach kids earlier. We also know that when kids handle food, and I know this from my own son, who was once an incredibly picky eater. When they cook, when we give them the trust of putting a knife in their hands and show them how to cook, they will eat vegetables with relish. And you can teach them everything they need to know about the environment in the garden. And we know that these kids in the edible schoolyard bring home new tastes to their families and actually change habits at home. So I think we should be making an enormous effort. I also think that the schools, here is a huge sum of public money buying food, right? One of the biggest institutional buyers of food in the country. They need to be setting standards for what they were willing to take to feed our children and what they won't. And they could drive an awful lot of change. And I think that Alice Waters' current efforts to use what she calls school-supported agriculture, by getting the schools in California to support California farms that are growing sustainably, regeneratively, is a powerful idea. Yes, it will cost more, but it will yield more too in the health of kids, in what they understand about food, and in the consumer habits they'll make for their whole lives. So I think it's a really important area of focus.
Great. Well, personally, it's been great to spend some time with you. I hope everyone here, I can see from the
Always,
questions
Andy.
and comments, got something out of this. It's
Yeah, I'm sorry I don't have more time, but I do have to go off and teach a class.
No, I'm going to hang in here to deal with some of the questions myself and stay
Right.
well. And when you have time, come back on my webcast too. We'll
I'd love to
explore
do
some of
that,
this
Andy.
stuff more.
Okay, take care. Bye, everybody.
Great. So we're going to continue on here. I think someone else will pop on screen with me as well, but I can handle some of your questions, the ones that I have some thoughts on based on 33 years of reporting, significantly on energy and also on food. I did want to pull up one thing that comes to mind because of who you all are and what you think about. A long time ago, we lost somebody too soon, Lee Shipper, who pre-court, all the pre-court people out there will know what I'm talking about. And he was in touch with me, not every day, but every month I would get an email from him. Back in, this is 2011 when he died, I wrote a bit of an homage piece, sort of hailing his energy for getting the energy out of our systems, including, he described at that time, he was working on the idea of peak travel, that people just don't keep traveling more and more and more. I think the pandemic has illustrated that we don't have to travel as much as we thought. But he also sent me a picture that relates to the conversation we just had with Michael. He would, email me when something was driving him crazy, and this was a supermarket somewhere in near Berkeley, courtesy of Lee Shipper. What are we doing having these open shelves unrefrigerated? We're refrigerating the earth by having open shelving in a supermarket, refrigerated and frozen food aisle. So here's to Lee Shipper and that spirit of always looking for something, sharing something related to your goals, and his goals live on. His daughter, Lisa Shipper, is now deeply involved in climate adaptation and resilience work. And I draw on her wisdom almost every day, literally right now, in dealing with some of these bigger issues. So just wanted to bring that up. Oh yeah, there, hi, how are you?
Hi, Andy, thank you so much for organizing that discussion with Michael. It's just fascinating. I'm sure we all would love to see more of that. And I know that we can see more of you on your webcast and in your blog and so forth. And so please connect with Andy at Sustain What and check out his content. I know that your content is very solutions oriented. So here we are at a behavior conference that coincides with COP26. We know that we only have between 4 and 8 years at current levels of emissions before we surpass 1.5 degrees of warming. And so that means that every business, every household needs to start thinking about, getting to zero carbon, or certainly our policymakers need to start thinking about how we can all get to zero carbon, really, as soon as possible. And if we care about this issue, sooner than possible.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, through your podcast and your content, what types of messages and stories, discussions are you producing that you think are going to resonate with people? Could you give us some examples of some stories that can really help drive those really deep changes that are needed?
Well, that's a very rich question with several layers. It's essentially, it comes down to what's your ecosystem, what are your connections, what are your passions. The worst aspect of the climate problem is it's so massive, monumental, climate crisis. Yeah, and I've been doing too much of this. I shouldn't say too much of this. Yeah, this is my 1988 article on global warming. So 1988, that's the year the IPCC was formed, the year 3 years before the negotiations at Rio on the Framework Convention. And I've been writing aspects of that story ever since. That conference there was a conference in Toronto in 1988, where a guy, a longtime climate scientist from the United States, ended that conference with exactly the same rhetoric you're hearing right now in Glasgow. If we choose to act, blah, 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 we're saving space for the future. Blah, blah, there's that blah, blah, blah phrase that Greta has made so famous. And what I've learned is that it's really important to sort of combine this will seem like doesn't make sense. The word urgency has to be combined with the word patience in how you think about where we go from here. Science has its limits, and the mitigation science that says in a perfect world, the trajectory for emissions, which has been going like this, now has to go like that. That's fine, but that's not going to change the world the way the world works right now. It's not going to change it. It'll change it through 10 or 20 or 30 years. We're still carbonizing more than we're decarbonizing. The word energy transition has very big limits. At the global level, it's still all energy addition. Renewables are still like frosting on this big fossil cake that's still growing. And I would like to say there's some magical message that can make everyone do the thing that needs to be done at the political level, at the national level, at the community level, and at the household level to accomplish big things. We have to do all at all those levels, but the expectation has to be coupled with an understanding of that moving from the world we live in to the world we desire is the work of a lifetime. And it's the work of the lifetimes of the young people who are at Glasgow right now. Barack Obama gave a really good speech this morning in which he tried to articulate, what a young person might think about going from this point where the urgency and the anger has to be channeled into action. And the actions are all there. Every community here in the Hudson River Valley where I live, there's this community choice aggregation model where a community can sign in for green energy from the grid. But there's some communities that have done it. There's some communities that don't even know what the hell that means. It's the world of acronyms, and our new New York State legislation is full of acronyms too. So doing the community to community connectivity and communication can really make a big difference. You can start to build a head of steam. I was talking earlier about myheat.ca. It's an interesting web enterprise in Canada that shows almost like a Google map for both energy emissions from households and who's got solar and the like. I think they've been involved with your conference in the past. I'm trying to arrange to do a session with them on the communication opportunities there. I've written a lot about infrared imagery, that heat imagery as both a prod on, it can work in two directions, cutting methane emissions, which are visible to those infrared cameras, and cutting household heat waste, which is visible to those cameras too. So finding ways to use tools like that can make a difference. And at the global scale, Environmental Defense Fund is launching a satellite. When I was 33 years ago, we were just setting up the satellite, the Landsat, the satellite systems we rely on for weather and GPS and stuff. And we now live in a world where the ability to observe methane emissions will be much more powerfully integratable with decision-making at that high level. So there's something to do, but those all take time. They all take a lot of work. They're all communication, technology, education, enterprise, finance. They're all intermixed. I wish I had a simple answer for you. There's no big message.
Well, it's reassuring to know that we need patience as well, because we all it's easy to have a lot of anxiety and urgency and realize we're in this for the long haul. So thanks for that.
And the other, of course, the flip side is adaptation, being resilient, building resilience, looking in your community for who doesn't have air conditioning and who's an elderly person when a heat wave is forecast, finding where the vulnerabilities are and being a true community. That's where the equity part comes in. The justice is making sure you're filling those gaps in resilience at the same time.
So I'm going to log off here. There's a lot of questions. Please use the Q&A. They've all been upvoted, and a number of these have 10, 13 likes. So Andy, I guess I'll let you take over from here. So thanks so much.
Okay, let's see here. It's small type for me and I'm getting older. So let's see.
There is a question I think that's really nice about personal carbon budgets, and I just
Oh, yeah.
reminds me of companies now. There are rating systems for companies that give you a temperature. This company is consistent with 1.58 degrees warming. This company is consistent with 3 degrees warming. Be interesting, this idea of carbon budgets, if we could actually all have our own temperature, something that I calculated actually one time. The idea of that our home has a temperature, but we as
Yeah.
individuals even have temperatures and responsibility.
Well, I think that gets back to what we were talking about with food, which is about awareness. Having things you can get to me, the precise numbers are less important than directionality. As it was Herman Daly, the great pioneering ecological economics wizard. He was on one of my shows recently with Kate Rayworth, the donut economics pioneer. And as he has said many times, if you're jumping out of an airplane, it's better to have a reliable parachute than a good altimeter. In other words, you don't want to, knowing measurement is less important than knowing directionality and getting things in the right way. So, but I think if we have these behavioral nudges or basic system awareness, and again, this goes to food with a QR code or something that gives you some index of what you're doing and how it relates to the things you care about, I think that's really important. I see Dave Hall is saying, oh no, Dagon Fowler is saying, thanks for mentioning my heat. Yeah, I think that, I'm talking with others about similar ways to use mapping technologies to convey insights and build a sense of community awareness and action. There is this real, it's the pull part of change that's, of course, I think historically more apt to get people's attention than the push part of change. And if you have a sense in your community that there's an opportunity for you in shifting energy norms, or, well, how is that solar panel working out on that guy's house? Or what is our community carbon footprint? How much is it from solar versus our transport? The more awareness you have, you can have better conversations, and that could lead to less polarized conversations around these things too. Let's see. What are good apps to detect carbon content of foods? I don't think there is. Well, maybe someone on this call knows about whether there is a good app for specifically the carbon content. I think you can make some general judgments right now that if I'm buying blueberries in January, they came from a long way away. Now, I don't think there's anything out there yet that tells me about blueberries that they're coming from Chile or somewhere in South America that have a lower carbon footprint. I'd look to know about it if anyone out there does know about it. I'm still seeing more of the residual questions about food. Let's see here. I see. I guess I'd rather use the chat because it's right in front of me and the headings are bigger. I could look at the Q&A comments, but they're really harder for me to see. Let's see here. Here's one I can get at. Ada Wara says, when we treated the recent pandemic as an emergency, we were able to mobilize and change behaviors within a short period of time. Should we not treat climate change as a real emergency? I have personally pushed back on the idea of using emergency rhetoric around the climate crisis. You would think, the guy who wrote the story that looks like that and thousands of others since then would see that differently. But this gets back to the scale of the problem. It's a long emergency at the very least. It's a multi-generational emergency. And there are friends of mine who use the similar terminology around it being a war on carbon, a war on climate. But then, beware what you wish for is one of the arguments against that. Michael Hume, H-U-L-M-E, in the UK, a scientist, IPCC scientist for a long time. He says, if you're talking about government mandates and you want to have mass mobilization and energy, that might create your landscape around your community that could suddenly be one with limited justice. If people's rights to their property is taken for transmission corridors. This is relevant here in the Northeast. Maine, people in Massachusetts are trying to get power from Quebec down through Maine. If that could be federally preempted, but then it leads to all kinds of questions too. So scale, and then just basically, to me, the emergency question is the remedies are not quick. We can cut carbon at a super aggressive pace, and that doesn't change climate impacts, whether you're in California, here in the Northeast, or in sub-Saharan Africa, or in South Asia. The behavior of the climate system takes decades to feel any healing component from a lowering of emissions because of the momentum of the climate system. I could throw a link into the chat that I encourage people to watch this very simple video that by some experts at MIT on the momentum monster in the climate system. And that means, it's not like you go to war and then you win the battle and then everyone lives a climate safe life. That doesn't happen. So there's marginal utility. And of course, then there's the question of whether the behavioral components worked out so well when it came to the virus. It's still the information environment to me, the crisis in the information environment to me is almost bigger than what I see as the climate crisis. It really is. We're stuck with a system right now that's very unnerving in the way it amplifies differences as opposed to helping us find common ground. And I think we have a lot of work to do there. And before we have a successful climate outcome, certainly in the United States. If Chris or Ruben, if you see some comments or questions you want to pose to me, that would be helpful, just because otherwise I'll have to take some time to read through them. There was a question for Michael about Al Gore. Has he evolved his message to include food? And I've known Al Gore forever. He endorsed my first global warming book back in 1992. He's talking creatively about finance, and I think any discussion of success on climate, it's not just about measuring CO2, it's also about measuring financial flows, particularly between developing countries who are so in need of financing, both for clean energy, for better food, for better resilience, and the rich countries that created so much of the climate impact on the system. We have to, the measurement has to be there too, not just in the CO2, which I think we're doing a better job of.
Hey, Andy, sorry to jump in here. I'm Ruben Sussman, AC.
No, I need you to help guide.
All right, I'm going to help out here. One of the big questions that was upvoted by 13 folks was Karen's question. In 2009, we experimented with the Beck conference meals, making the default choice vegetarian and allowing people to opt out of the vegetarian meal and opt in for animal protein instead. And we went from 80% eating meat-based to 20% eating meat-based. Can you comment on any nudges as a strategy for reducing food?
Totally. One thing, and maybe I can follow up with anyone at the meeting, get in touch with me at Revkin or on Twitter or ar667@columbia.edu. It's the 10 years ago, around that time, when I was at the Climate, Mind, and Behavior meetings at the Garrison Institute, 5 miles from my house. There was a lot of talk of what's called a behavioral wedge, 1 billion tons a year by 2050 of avoidable emissions through behavior insights. And that all went away. If you go on Google Scholar and look for that phrase, it went away. I don't know if it went away because people realized it's a kind of embedded in the other wedges. So that makes it complex. But this point you just made, for example, there was a school, I think it was a private school in Connecticut, where they took away the trays in the cafeteria. So students had to take their lunch to the table, just carrying it in their hands. And it greatly reduced food waste because they didn't have a way to pile on the extra snacks and stuff that they wanted. So I think there's huge opportunities to test what works and what doesn't. This gets to supermarkets too. When Michael said there's a section of the supermarket where he can find all of the non-meat items he wants, but supermarkets create these kind of barricades, as long as it's walled off in some separate part, so that when you're looking for the non-dairy Alfredo sauce, it's not in the Italian food aisle. It's over in some special place. As long as it's sort of sequestered, these conversations we're having will be sequestered. And I think those are issues that have to be explored.
Thanks for mentioning that. And actually, I do want to bring to the audience's attention that two of the authors of that behavioral wedge paper are going to be at our closing plenary. So that's a nice segue.
Oh, cool.
Tom Dietz and Paul Stern are there. And that, yes, that's an important piece of the puzzle, the behavioral wedge. So another, Kristen Heinemeyer asks, there's a lot of discussion in the chat about Walmart. Many feel they're quote, a bad company with labor practice, et cetera. Yet their scale makes them big potential for change. Similar issues with the military. How can environmentalists evaluate the role of the entities we traditionally want to avoid?
Well, maybe I'll bring up this is less on the consumer side than on the production side, but Environmental Defense Fund, actually, they did it on both sides. Way, way back in the 80s, they took a lot of heat for working with McDonald's to think about successors to the styrofoam container. It's the taking heat part that's interesting. And in around 2000, EDF started working with the oil and gas industry to do the measurements on their property, at their facilities, their wells and their compressing stations and transmission stations, to clarify what's up with methane coming from oil and gas wells. They took an enormous amount of heat for that. If you go on search for EDF methane, oil and gas, you'll find a bunch of papers that resulted that really laid the foundation for the work that we're now looking at being manifested at COP26. The announcements and commitments around methane reduction are because we have a better sense of where it comes from in these industries. And that only happens by working with the industry. At the same time, environmental lawyers can litigate them on the other end. And when industry organizations like the American Petroleum Institute are in Washington lobbying against these things that make sense, then there's a political component to work on there too. But if someone isn't working with the companies to take ESG from being more than a hashtag, then we're going to face problems. And this also came up too. The consumer absolutely plays a role. There was some clothing outfit in New York City decades ago where the advertising I heard every day on the radio was, our best customer is an educated consumer. And yes, we need educated consumers if we want to have reasoned awareness of the impacts of whether it's clothing or food or anything else we have. And companies can take on some of that responsibility. Patagonia is example, sort of mid-scale example of a company that does that. But other companies are still in the early phases of doing that.
Thanks, Andy. I note that we have 2 more minutes left, so maybe one more question. How do you feel about food-related questions? We have a couple in the chat left over from Michael Pollan. Are you okay fielding a food-related question?
Yeah.
All right,
I have written about
it. All right, so my team, C. Dale Schaefer Morrison says, my team researches land use decision-making among US farmers. One of our findings is that in choice experiments, farmers don't necessarily respond to incentive programs, as many of them view the programs as impermanent or subject to change by new administrations. In other words, the perceived risk is too high. How do you envision incentives designed at the government level to reduce this perceived risk? Any thoughts on that? It's a tough one to end on, and I realize we have 1 minute left. So,
well, I'd say the one thing, there's some aspects of my thinking 35 years into my journey that are more libertarian than they used to be. In other words, anything that feels like it's too much of a cookie cutter, NEPA, not just regulation, but if you have a complex system designed to tweak down to the local level and create a meaningful decision, it really doesn't work. So what you want to do is find ways to manifest and enable and empower local wisdom with general principles in mind. And that's an interesting question. What does that look like going forward, whether it's environmental controls and pollution, whether it's water use? There are ways to do it that where the government can facilitate, can sort of offer nudges as well as definitely prods when they're needed. But I think that would be my takeaway there.
Thanks, Andy. And we sincerely value your insights and your time with us. This has been a fantastic and very enlightening conversation. I do want to mention to everybody online that you can follow Andy. Andy has posted into the chat his.
I'm showing my blog.
There we go. Check it out. Very helpful and interesting. Good way to keep the conversation going.